Hello everyone, welcome to our book launch this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here to launch Jee Leong Koh's new collection, Inspector, Inspector, which is published at the end of this month. I'm Jasmine, I'm from Carcanet, and I'm just going to run over what's going to happen this evening before we get started properly. So we're just going to be together for about an hour this evening. I can see that loads of you have found the chat box. Please do find it, say hello to us, let us know where you're watching from, let us know what you think of the reading throughout. And if you have any technical issues as well, throughout the event, just pop them in the chat and I'll do my best to help you as we go. Jee is going to read for us this evening, and while he's reading, I'm going to have the text up on screen as sort of a visual guide for you. Just be aware that you're in control of your own screen. So if you want Jee to be bigger and the text to be smaller, you're in control of that. So have a play around and you should be able to reconfigure it to suit your own needs. After Jee has read, he's going to discuss the collection with Jerrold Yam, who I'm very pleased that we're joined by. And then there will be time for audience questions. So as well as finding the chat box, please find a different button which says Q&A, and you can get your questions for Jee lined up in there, and then Jerrold can put them to him later on in the event. Okay, I think that's everything that I need to tell you for now. Thank you. Sorry, the last thing is thank you for paying your £2 to be here. We really, really appreciate that. There is a link in the chat for you to buy a copy of the book, but also you'll get an automatic email tomorrow. So don't stress about doing that now. Just check your inbox tomorrow and you can get your discounted version of the book yourself. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Jerrold Yam, who is a lawyer based in London, and he's also the author of poetry collections. He's published 3 books with Ethos Press and 2 with Math Paper Press. So it's great that he's here and he's going to introduce Jee for us now. So I'll just hand over. Thanks, Jerrold.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Can everyone hear me okay? I will take that as a yes. Thank you. Thanks, James. So yeah, thanks, Jasmine. I'm very thrilled to be a part of the launch of Jee's second poetry collection to be published in the UK. Let me formally introduce Jee before saying a few words on his new book. And I'm just going to read the introduction on the author from Inspector, Inspector. Jee Leong Koh is the author of Steep Tea, also published with Carcanet, named a Best Book of the Year by the Financial Times and a finalist by Lambda Literary in the United States. He has published 4 other books of poems, a volume of essays, a collection of zuihitsu, and a hybrid work of fiction entitled Snow at 5 p.m., Translations of an Insignificant Japanese Poet. We would be hard-pressed to find another poet with such linguistic versatility. Inspector, Inspector is his second Carcanet book. Born and raised in Singapore, educated in England, Koh lives in New York City, where he heads the literary non-profit Singapore Unbound. So just to briefly introduce this collection, Inspector, Inspector is a tender homage to the complexities of fatherhood and sonship, to the variegated pursuits of and manifestations as well of desire and sexuality. It interrogates the poets and my country of origin, Singapore, weaving the personal with the political, though since when have these ever been capable of separation? The collection largely comprises of 4 poetic sequences. Firstly, 13 palinodes written in the voice of the speaker's dead father, which, according to the synopsis, the speaker answers when the father's voice falls silent. Secondly, we've got 7 poems which read like diary entries on sexual encounters. Thirdly, the titular poetic sequence sardonically describes various inspections taking place in a myriad of modern circumstances, like Zoom backgrounds, contact tracing, and racial dynamics. And finally, we've got 10 poems making up the series entitled a simple history of Singaporeans in America. And this is based on factual accounts and interviews with people living in the US together with the speaker. I guess the speaker's migratory kinsman of sorts. There is so much that I'd like to unpack with Jee in this breathtaking collection. So without further ado, let's invite Jee to don his inspector's glasses and read from the book.
Thank you so much, Jerrold, actually, for that introduction and for agreeing to be my interlocutor for this event. Thanks everyone for coming. It really, really warms the heart to see so many of you here from all over the world. I really, really do appreciate your spending, an hour or so, with us here today. And I also want to thank Jasmine, all right, from Carcanet for actually organizing this event. We didn't really give her very much time at all, and yet she managed to pull everything together, and here we are. So thank you so much, Jasmine and Becky, all right, for doing all of the background necessary work. I'm so pleased to actually share with you my new Carcanet collection, Inspector. Yes, I want to thank Michael and John too for believing in the work. Having put out my first collection, Steep Tea, in 2015, they decided to take on a second collection published in the UK in August and officially to be published in the US in October. So I'm going to actually be reading some poems, from the collection before, Jerrold and I engage in a kind of conversation that hopefully will open many doors for you to participate in the conversation as well. And the poems I've chosen to actually read from the collection form a kind of journey through the collection. So there'll be a sampling of each section or sequence of the collection, but hopefully the poems themselves that I'm going to read today is also will actually be cohesive and coherent. So, threading its way through this collection is a series of 13 palinotes in the voice of my dead father. A palinote is less a poetic form than a poetic gesture. That's how I think about it, right? Because it's really a poem in which the speaker retracts an earlier statement that he has made. So by writing this series of 13 palinotes in the voice of my dead father, I basically make my dad retract statements that he may or may not have made in his life. Why do I do that? All right, you have to stay on, for the conversation when Jerrold will get a chance to interrogate me on my motivations for doing so. But I'm going to read you one palinote that really, I think, sets the scene for today's reading. This is palinote in the voice of my dead father, 3. All the time, the air sacs in my lungs winked out like lights in an inhabited valley. The locks of my heart closed at semi-regular intervals, my legs waterlogged. I thought, I have no regrets for living the way I did, where I did. The lights blessed the smoky Saturday dances with the implausibly slim waists of girls. The canals met us with boats on their leisured way somewhere to which our legs would deliver us. But we never left the valley. We bought a house, paid for by running the machines, maintaining cool and comfortable the valley air. We had the two of you, as the valley said to do. And then first the smoke drifted over from the next valley and choked to death all our animals. And the smoke, staying years and years, so long we had almost acclimatized ourselves to it, was followed by the flood. Now, unlike my father and his possible regrets for not moving out of Singapore or living somewhere else, I did, because of course I moved to New York City in 2003, and that was what, 19 years ago? So I feel as if I have some modicum of experience now to write the next poem I'm going to read to you, called To a Young Poet. To a young poet, quit the country soon as you can, before you are set on a career path or marrying the home ownership scheme. Pay no heed to the village elders. They are secretly ashamed that they did not leave. Quit the country, but do not shake the dust off your feet against it. Leave instead with a secret smile for all that leaving has to teach you. Learn what it is to be welcome, for the coin in your purse, for strong hips in pushing a cart uphill, a firm voice in a good cause. When the welcome wears off, as it will, learn to leave again, this time by the sea. Be always on your way, and on arrival, sleep with anyone who asks. You never know what gift they may have for you in the morning. You will discover suddenly, or over the course of a winter night, what gift you have for them. Always kiss goodbye on the lips. There will be seasons of great loneliness. You cannot outrun it. So sit and survey the thunderless desert. In every town, pick up the local accent and blend it into yours, already impure, as a secret ingredient is fused into the top note of a perfume. Hearing you, the Taverna will wonder where you are from. Drink deep of their wonderment. Do not betray it. After you leave a good tip for the barkeep, climb to your narrow roof and write whatever you wish. Your flowers will grace the sweaty brow of a buffalo. Your politics will smell of perfume. If you write about the old country, you will write about a lover who leaves your side in the night to stand by the window and look up at the crescent moon. So basically, I took the advice I am dishing out and had a wonderful decade in my 30s in New York City, and started writing a sex diary, charting my adventures in the early years in the city. And I've started writing a sequence of sonnets on these diary entries, and the unfinished sequence. Some of the sonnets have been printed in Inspector. I just want to read for you 3 of them. This is from the sequence called Ungovernable Bodies. Andy, May 27, 2007, Sunday, Mr. Black. Mr. Black was a gay bar that's no longer around. And of course, that's one of the things that make you a New Yorker, when you can tell somebody else, a relatively, newbie, that you knew, the time when this bar was around. Andy came back to my place, arousing to suck him and then to jerk off myself. He stayed until Monday afternoon. The tunnel has been closed for some time now, but a claw of panthers find their cast iron steps from daylight street to basement dungeon to suffer the flail of ecstasy. Mr. Conductor, when will train service begin? The velvet rope that ties one to all harmonically. The rose boy is antsy. The brick archers jump from toe to toe, making an entrance for the black detective with a blank map. He does not come in the name of the law, but with a nose ring that glints in the dark. Follow him. Father has been buried here for far too long. We will exhume his bones and beat a retreat playfully. with the firmer. Andy, June 16, 2007, Saturday, my sister's place in Fairfax County, Virginia. Phone sex, mutual jerk off. Is not a design flaw, but a design plus. The weak digital signal from my phone to the equally weak receiver in yours, the call boosted by the tall radio mast. For our heated talk cannot be stopped, and it cannot stop another's intercourse as long as we are all on frequencies slightly different, long undulating waves. The all-important must cannot be marriage. Although I'm calling from the home office in my dear sister's 3-bedroom house, but multiple coordinated arrangements for long-term care and instant kindness in radio cells of the gift of honeycomb. Andy, July 1st, 2007, Sunday, my place. Came to my place and we had sex, took Monday off from work and walked in Central Park and had dinner in Chelsea. The day after sex should be a day off for contemplation, walking in the park, or basically doing nothing at all, except to reunite the shattered body. Here comes a leg floating down the river, the left appendage judging by its toes. Rescue the right hand, so helpful last night, before it hunts and gathers yet again. Now we wait for the torso, the exposed and powerful chest, the hard-working abs, the part that's made up of so many parts. And following behind, the skinny ass, the daily divisor of good and evil, bobbing like an apple, the singing head. Well, that was something of my own history in my early years in New York City. But I've also been very curious about the history of some of my fellow Singaporeans who actually, moved from Singapore to New York. And so I decided to write, to interview them, to talk to them about, why they decided to make that move. And these stories, these interviews are, with their permission, have become part of an ongoing series that I'm writing called A Simple History of Singaporeans in America. And I would just like to read you one of them today. This is The Ceramicist, and it's written for Hong Ling Wee, who arrived in New York in 1992. On a NASA scholarship to map the world, she walked into a workshop on a whim. Could throw a lump of clay on a wheel and feel a foggy, quiet, pink revolving world evolve into an object of the mind, under the body's pressure, slight and sure. And afterwards, surrender to the fire, not that of fire, but that of accident, for a ceramic rocket fallen back to Earth. And this she did for many years, living on little, explaining less, until she was surrounded by the fuselage. When the towers gashed vermilion and buckled, she was alone at home in Union Square. The noise expanded as it dribbled off to meet its echo. Second detonation, worse than the first report, in summoning half-buried images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a foreign mood, she heard the phone ring, and a female voice, acclimatized but recognizable as Singaporean, asked for Wee Hong Ling. She never tires of telling this story, how the consulate located her and every Singaporean within an hour of disaster, when a black hole opened, but it was avoided because a star had called, a star called home. She never tires of telling this story, which I now tell you in my own fanciful way, Each iteration also explanation, the how developing into the why. Why her pitches, bowls, vases levitate. Well, having lived here, for so long, as many people, have to deal with, we have to deal with the death of parents in the country of our origins, and this is something that I had to deal with. I was very fortunate, of course, to be able to be by my father's bedside when he actually left us. As I said, the 13 Palanos weave their way through the whole collection in the voice of my dead father, and when finally his voice falls silent at the end of the 13th Palanode, I answer in this poem in my own voice, called The Reply. It's a long poem, so sit back, relax, and I hope, some of this will get through to you. The Reply. You are silent now, and it's no surprise. You have been a silent movie all my life. That's poetry's way of putting it, and it's dead wrong. You're no chaplain, funny and glamorous, although you may be one of the many minions in Metropolis. No, you're not the proof for a thesis. My earliest memory is riding on your shoulders, heading home from the merry-go-round. My last memory of you living, your lung walls succumbing to the flooding, is the speechless and tearless hospital bed, and me planting a kiss on your forehead. Between these short clips, you bicycling down the gentle swerve of road that hugs the bottom slope of Mount Faber like a rug. Me sitting with my pianica on the top tube, legs slightly raised to free the circling paddles. We're a home movie that nobody wants to watch except the family. The ones knowing, sentimental, and disputatious. Your 4 brothers, rich with arrogance. Your 2 sisters, hard as stale biscuits, expect you to agree with them, and you do, backpedaling as you do. That's the rub. I see it and judge it craven of you. Not seeing then, I am your best reply. What with my school honors and eventually my scholarship to go overseas. While mother hogs the weekly phone calls with talk of winter clothes and shopping malls, your silence grows and grows on me, profound as the first snow falling on college grounds. At the end of time, 3 long exciting years, out of Heathrow, mother and you appear, and I'm shocked to see the snow in your hair. Loveliest of trees, the cherry now is hung with bloom along the bar. To my flowering regret, you've flown the distance, but I deny you the pomp and circumstance. Thinking myself above empty ceremonies and you and mother below the Latin service, I don't sign up for the Sheldonian show, but throw together an improvised shoot of us in the college garden, me geared up and you gamely following this young pup. Not a word of reproach, not a subtitle. My Joe pays off his Pip's unpaid bills. You won't know the reference, but you would like Joe, both of you working men, he a blacksmith and you an electrician, both of you surviving shits for fathers with your goodness intact, saving dicks for sons with your belief in the best of lucks. There I go, showing off my learning and irreverence. There I go again, poetrying. I'm still answering my aunts and dear uncles who are dying, dead, or softening to the middle of their heads. It's worsening since living in New York. I have written book after book after book and placed them like bombs in your hands. You keep them carefully by your Bible in the high drawer of the TV cabinet, the cheek by the turn your other cheek. Where is strength? Where is weakness? What is truly evil? What is goodness? The freedom fighters, someone's terrorist, someone's draft dodger, the pacifist. This week, my 11s read the Oedipus, and like all generations, were nonplussed by the enormities wrought by right intent, fleeing father murder to father murder, abjuring mother sex to sleep with her. If to save a baby is to kill all babies through the lightning plague in the city, what should we do with the mewling mess, milk stain exposed, ankle torn, on the green wooded slopes of Kithaeron? There are some places like Singapore that would make the careful calculation. There are some places like Greece, once, that would pose the question and no more. You, my father, are the Grecian oracle. There I go again. This habit of reading life as if it's a work of art, this tendency grows from the library books devoured tenderly on the walk home, while avoiding the lances thrusting up like lampposts. And you encourage me, give me courage, when at the book's corner you leave me and shop with mother for life at OG. You show me as an unschooled man's able, you are replaceable and irreplaceable. At your wake, attended by relatives and a number of poet friends, I give the reply of the living to the dead. For you looking oddly like bread in the yellowing husk of your body, the eulogy begins with the bicycle, and it says, I remember, just that. All the carefully chosen phrases reducible to one refrain. But a letter is not an eulogy. It has much more of me in it, and at last, much more of you, my father, in me. When you're loaded into the oven, to lift from us the annual burden of visiting and sweeping your grave, I'm seized by a wild desire to swear that before every poetry reading, I'll say, I'm Koh Jee Leong, the son of Koh Dat Se, in the manner of the Malay and the Scots. The desire passes. Let this be the brother, the guilty brother to the dead and gone. The reply, a replacement for other ones. The movie you and I together caught. The son you have for the sons you have not. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jee. I mean, that was a very lovely reading and a lovely curation of the poems in the collection, which nicely segues into our discussion. And I'd like to start us off where your previous Carcanet collection, Steep Tea, left off. In Steep Tea, it was a collection about female presence, poetic mothers, poetic female inspirations, their fluency, their volubility, their vulnerability and accessibility, even if problematic, like Mary Oliver's Singapore. And in Inspector, obviously there's a shift from maternal to paternal, but the paternal is infused with the absence of their volubility, their silence. And this is most explicitly demonstrated in the 13 palinodes, some of which you've read earlier. Could you tell us more about that switch between female to male, but also from presence to absence, and how that impacts on writing this collection.
Mm. Well, thank you so much, Jerrold, for that question. It's a really wonderful question because it allows me to talk about both books at once. As you said, my previous collection, Carcanet collection, Steep Tea, really tries to engage with women poets, right, from around the world. And really that collection began with my reading of the Irish poet Evan Boland, because I started writing poems in response to her poems, right? And that was how it all came about. I realized I could do this for many, many other women poets for a whole collection. And why Evan Boland actually, meant so much to me at that point is that in her poetry, I see some of the same struggles, different of course, others, but there were some of the same struggles. And these tussles have to do with being a colonial and post-colonial subject, the struggle with gender roles, and her thinking about, myth versus history, right? And her attempt to always kind of recover the voices that are lost to history. And so, for me, writing, Steep Tea was really a process of discovery because I realized how few women poets I knew. So I really set myself a project to just read more women poets and find myself, as with Evan Boland, writing a lot of poems in response to these women poets. And there is actually a link between that and this new book, Inspector, because how I discovered the palinode, all right, which is of course the kind of thread through the entire new book, is actually in the work of the Asian American poet Monica Yuen in her book Black Acre. All right, so she used a palinode there, and I've never seen this before. So obviously I was intrigued and I went to find out about it, and soon realized that it was so relevant to the project that I was, trying to grapple with. How do I write about my father, right? Who was in his life such a quiet man. I hardly remember, very much many things that he has said. I mean, he did a great deal for us. But in terms of voice, I don't remember, what he said. And whatever I could remember when I was much younger, was that he would agree with everybody that he talked to. So, he might be talking to two different people, and then they will be giving like completely opposite, opinions, and he will agree with one, and then he will agree with the other. And then
he's a politician, Jee.
Yeah, right. You see, I did not see that quality. What I thought was like, oh, how unprincipled you are. I mean, it speaks to my own moral rigidity, I guess. I would never make a good politician. But he had to. And he had to, and I can talk about this a little bit more later on. It's also partly because of class, right? Because if you are kind of, dependent on your bosses and bosses, right? That's what you do. I mean, you have to agree with, whoever tells you, what to think in some way. But anyway, so for me, writing these palinodes, right, was less a process of, discovery as it was with the women poets in Steep Tea. It was less a process of recovery. There was really nothing to recover because I don't remember what my father has said. But it was really more a process of invention, right? So I was kind of like, trying to invent things for him to say, if only to hear his voice again, right? And what I was inventing were regrets because, palinodes are essentially retractions, right? Because I cannot help wondering in writing these palinodes, what are the regrets in his life, right? And what are some of the regrets that I should have been able to assuage, but did not? So therefore, they also become my regrets, right? Because I was not able to do more for him, to help him to be less regretful. So, yeah.
Yeah, and we see this very powerfully in the last poem that you read, The Reply. Regrets on I guess, both sides, on speakers as well as on the father's side of things. And it charts this whole trajectory and shared history from first memory to burial to death. How has writing about these family relationships changed your own understanding of them and their countervailing tensions, their complexities?
Yeah, I mean, I would, go back to what I just alluded to in my previous answer, and that is what has really come into focus for me as I was writing this new book is the class difference between my parents and me, all right? Because, my dad was a working man, and as a working man, he had to learn to suppress his voice, right? Or to fit his opinions to his social, superiors. At least that was how I was interpreting it. But I'm a professional, right? I'm a teacher, all right? And I can actually afford to have an independent voice. But of course, the complication is that he wanted me to have this upward mobility, right? By providing for my education. But at the same time, it is this very education that has kind of alienated me from him, right? So we no longer talk about the same things, right? I mean, I would be passionate about things that he might listen to, but but may not be passionate about, right? Whether it is poetry or ideas or history or whatsoever. And in fact, my writing the Palanos in Inspector marked this difference, right? I mean, Palanos is has all that prestige of an ancient Greek form, right? And so it does actually further, I think, alienate me from him in that way. In thinking about your question too, I also think back about the classical tragedy Medea by Euripides, which I teach in my private school on the Upper West Side of New York City, and so that's why it's so much on my mind. That in Medea, Medea, the protagonist, actually describes marriage in terms of migration, right? So that's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, to marry into another family is like moving into a foreign country. Right? And for me, class mobility is the same, right? To move into another class is also like, moving into a foreign country with a very, different milieu, with very different mores, right? So, I'm reminded, of course, that, my form of migration is very much a form of privilege, right? I was not forced out of Singapore, because of political dissidence or because I had no economic opportunities in Singapore, but I actually chose to. I had enough savings for my MFA program. I got a job, as I said, in an independent school in NYC because Oxford University was on my resume. I mean, I cannot deny that was, partly what actually, made me a viable candidate, right, to the school. And so these things, even migrations, moving away from Singapore, moving away from my family, always reminds me of the difference between us.
Yeah, so you talked about so those differences in class and opportunities, and obviously, there are a few poems in the collection that allude to the fact that you wouldn't be where you are today. Well, all of us really, without the sacrifices of the previous generation and the work that they put in. The format, the form and structure and pacing of the palinodes stand for me in stark contrast to the other poems in the collection. So they read almost like tentative, hesitant steps, almost a sense of fear of even having a voice. So would you mind just giving us some insight as to how you've gone about sort of writing those poems?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, a really, really good description about how, those very, very short lines create the tone, right, of hesitation, tentativeness that you've just described. Yeah. For me, the technical challenge was, I really wanted to write short lines, which I have not done before, except in the haiku that I wrote for my hybrid work of fiction, Snow at 5 p.m., translations of an insignificant Japanese poet. Now that other work, actually consists of 107 haiku about, Central Park, and a kind of a commentary, right, by a fictional commentator, who, in commenting on the haiku, actually reveals something of his own family history of himself, and therefore something of America. So writing those haiku, I mean, without caring about syllabic count, but paying very much attention to short lines and the enormous work and German then has to do. All right, really, encouraged me, I guess, to actually try it again, right? But not in a haiku form, but just in a longer poem. And it's interesting. I mean, I use those short lines, and then I discovered exactly what you have described, that it makes my, supposed, father's voice very tentative, very hesitant, which I guess, I think of it as kind of like, you know, um, appropriate, because he was not a very, vocal person. But also, I guess, not just the voice of my father, but the voice of the dead, that if the dead suddenly find themselves again able to speak, then they would not speak in a flow of words, right? They would be like trying out again the mechanism of the jaw or the vocal cords, and so it seems to be a very appropriate lineation as well as tone for that series.
That is a beautiful explanation. And I think another area in the collection where we see that relationship between form and substance, if I can put it that way, would be your series from Ungovernable Bodies, where each poem is accompanied by a really factual, almost forensic description of names, dates, venues, the physical acts involved. And that account sort of contextualizes each poem in that series. Could you tell us more about the sequence itself, and also, the reasons behind maybe including them in a collection that is explicitly about fatherhood and sonship? Are you perhaps suggesting something about, companionship between men in general?
Yeah, that's a great question, to ask as well, because it does not seem at first, right, to fit into a book about fathers, isn't it? The way I think about it is I deliberately included two ongoing, unfinished, poetic sequences in this book. These are projects I'm still working on. One, of course, is Ungovernable Bodies, right? And then the other, of course, is A Simple History of Singaporeans in America. And my idea, behind putting these unfinished sequences into the book is actually a kind of reminder to myself that, death can just cut us off mid-project, mid-life, whatever it is, and therefore it can be so arbitrary. I mean, who knows, right? I mean, it might very well be the case that these are the only parts of the sequence or the future book that I would be able to write. I would not be able to write anything more than that. So they are there, I guess, to suggest, the unfinished life, no matter how full someone has lived their life, how rich somebody's life has been, there's still this sense that there could have been more. And therefore, for death to cut it off is in some way to leave that life unfinished. But more particularly about, ungovernable, sonnets, I mean, Ungovernable Bodies, they're all written in a sonnet form. And I do find for me, I've used the sonnet form in my very, very first book, Payday Loans, was a month of sonnets. And that was a time when, I was about to graduate from Sarah Lawrence and everything was chaotic. I didn't know whether I would be able to stay in the country, whether I would be able to get a job. And so at that time, and still now, the sonnet form became a way for me to exert some kind of control over my life, over my material. And in the same way, I think I'm doing so here, all right, to actually, use the sonnet form to exert some kind of control over these. I mean, really the boundlessness, right, of material about sex. But for me, a sonnet form is also an argument of sort. So, these poems are not just, poems about sex, but I'm hoping to actually discover in these mini arguments a larger argument for some kind of sexual politics. There's a kind of political dimension to these poems that I hope will finally be seen, when I actually finish the project. And then, yet another reason for the sonnet, of course, is that it links me to tradition, right? In particular, a gay tradition, right? Shakespeare's sonnets, for example. All right, but whereas, of course, Shakespeare's sonnets, remain maddeningly ambiguous in terms of the details, I want to provide the diary details. I want to give all the details, right? What is, because it forms such a great contrast, all right, in tone, in language to the sonnets itself, the lyricism of the sonnet versus a very matter-of-fact description of sex in the diary. And I think, for me, perhaps this, what I imagine would be, a little contribution I could make to the sonnet tradition whereby you can actually, import prose, all right, into this, most lyrical of poetry forms, poetic forms.
Absolutely, and I think growing up reading about sonnets, they're always about really high sort of ideas, love and war, and the fact that you put in the things that you write about in the sonnet form that extends the conversation. That hey, actually, there is no restriction. There's no OB markers as to what constitutes subject matter for a sonnet today. That might heretofore not have been the case in the past. So yeah, I think that really sort of was very apparent in that sequence, like particularly. So I think,
yeah, if I can just jump in, Jerrold here, because I think you are probably aware, even though you're also away from Singapore, there is a kind of developing discourse in Singapore, isn't it, to actually, and a kind of colonial discourse, right? And in this discourse, some of the, perhaps, less accommodating or conciliatory, temperaments have actually come out against the sonnet form as something Western, isn't it? Right? There's something kind of like colonialist about it. And I mean, obviously, since I use the form, I don't think so, because my way into the form is really through my connection to other queer poets, right, who have actually used the form, not just in the West, but in many other places as well. So I think there is something, I hate to use the word subversive, but it's something, kind of like, a matter of resistance too, that when you're using the sonnet form, it doesn't mean that you are kind of like kowtowing, right, to the West, right? But really to see yourself also as a kind of a part of a much longer tradition, in fact, a worldwide tradition of people who wants to actually think seriously about sex and love and death.
Yeah, I think our relationship with language is complicated. You're right, by the fact that we're Singaporean, so obviously, a colony in the past, and people always, I mean, even in the city in London where I'm based, people always, are quite surprised, especially the less well-traveled among us, that we speak, perfectly, good English, even better, I'd say, than the average British person, by virtue of our education system. And I got reminded of that poem in Steep Tea, Attribution, where really the point is that we can't claim lineage or ownership of a language. It's just a meaningless exercise. But before we go down that rabbit hole, I think, you also mentioned about, Singapore and our relationship to language. And Singapore really features strongly in this second collection of yours, Inspector, where you've undertaken, really extensive interviews with fellow Singaporeans in America. And for me, reading it as an overseas Singaporean, it is powerful because we're not just relying on the speaker's singularity in migration, that one decision to, like you described before when you were reading the poems, uproot yourself, take the scholarship, go overseas, first to England and then to the US. But it sets it in context alongside other Singaporeans that have, taken root in America, thereby lending it a sense of sort of community. Could you describe, what was the motivation behind including this sequence on Singaporeans overseas, and maybe some of the process that's involved? How did you execute the interviews, etc.?
Yeah. Right. I don't want to bore everybody with too many technical details about how I actually gotten those interviews. But basically, I just started with my friends, people I know best, who trust me, with their life stories, because in fact, that's what it is, isn't it? And the funny thing, of course, is that when you talk to, people, you realize that, very naturally, they have already narrated their life stories to themselves, right? So they have a certain story in their head about, how they come to be where they are, right? So I try to tease that out of them, and then perhaps, through my questions, try to, get us to think about whether that story can be seen in different ways. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't, right? But really, I see my main job as an interviewer to be kind of a listener, right? And people want to tell their story, and I just scribbled away in my book in longhand, or in shorthand, actually, but I don't use a tape recorder. I don't use a laptop, whatever it is. I'm actually writing down notes because I do find that sometimes in the profusion of what they said, much can be lost, all right, in the density. And in fact, if I'm actually forced to write, I'm actually writing and processing what they're saying and actually, kind of selecting, highlighting things that I think are relevant as I go along. But it's also not a one-way process, right? Because in some of these poems, in a history of Singaporeans in America, even in Inspector, you can tell, right, that the interviewee also has a great deal of power over the process, right? They can actually decide what to tell you, what not to tell you. And they know me, so they know certain things that I would definitely pick up on and would love it. I would definitely include it in their poem, and then they know that some other things may not interest me, and so they don't tell me. So
things
really,
that can't be publicly disclosed, they will leave out.
right. I mean, it's all kind of, of course, I have their permission to publish his poem, so they know it's going to be in public, right? So there's also one limitation, right, of such a history. But really, I also called it a simple history because it is actually a phrase I took from Henry James, all right, who called in his Portrait of a Lady a simple history. And now in his days, of course, a simple history is also, another name for fiction. He's writing a work of fiction. He's under no illusion in the Portrait of a Lady. He's writing a history. So by calling my sequence a simple history, I'm also drawing attention to the kind of fictionalizing dimension and elements, right, of all our storytelling. Yeah.
Artistic license. Conscious of time, so let me just pick out a few sort of questions from our audience, and there are quite a few now, so apologies that we won't be able to go through all of them, but I think a natural sort of first question from the audience would be where you left off in your response earlier about the sequence on overseas Singaporean. So the question is, are any of the subjects of your poems in the audience tonight?
I have not had a chance to see who has joined us since I last looked at the attendees panel. I don't think they are here right now. Correct me if I'm wrong, please, in the chat. All right, please let me know. But I actually did a reading yesterday night at the Bryant Park reading room, and a number of them turned up for it. So. Hong Ling Wee, whose poem The Ceramicist, I just read. She came. I also read The Ceramicist in front of her, and then there were others too whose poems I have written, but I've not included it into Inspector, because I really also want it to be coherent as a book about fathers. So those poems, of course, I hope to actually bring out later on in a book of its own.
Right, and speaking
and
of,
I see Kopin is here, sorry.
Yeah, there are a couple of them here in the chat, but you mentioned coherence in putting the collection together. There's a question from the audience about how the different threads could be braided together. Did you see, sort of the collection in its final form at the earlier stages when you're putting the strands together, or did it only come to you perhaps subconsciously towards the end of the writing process?
Yeah, I have always written, well, not always. I have very, very often written in sequences. I mean, in my very, very first book, Payday Loans, as I say, was a month of sonnets, right? So I have found sequences to kind of impose a kind of discipline on me. I try my best to, wake up and write on most days. And a sequence, of course, you can write something that is whole and self-standing and yet be part of something bigger. Right, and that is something very appealing to me about that. I quoted in my very first book, Payday Loans, right, the idea given by Paul Goodman, all right, the American poet, about how poets who write from day to day never actually write a poem that is self-standing, right? To actually understand, the poet's mind, you have to read everything, right? You have to piece the various fragments together, and that's very appealing to me because I like the wholeness of each poem, like for example a sonnet, but at the same time to me it is always tentative, it is always incomplete, and you can actually suggest that, of course, by putting it in the form of a sequence, right? because then you have to go on to the next one. You have to go on to the next one. Even at the, the very last installment of the sequence, it's still open-ended because a sequence could have gone on forever, right? So and so forth. So when I put together the poems in Inspector, at first I was kind of arranging them in terms of their contrasting qualities. So if I have a bunch of erotic poems, I want to have a bunch of other poems, and then different, whatever it is, and then trying to put my best poems right in key places, all right, of the collection. And then I show it to a friend of mine, Andrew Howdell in Leeds, UK, who is the person I always go to for help to look at it, and he was like, no, this doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't develop an argument of sorts, all right? And he was the one who very wisely told me that the reply, the poem that I just read, right, the long elegy from my dad, must close the collection, because really there's nothing to be said after that. And I'm so glad I took his advice. So definitely consulting with someone else is always very helpful, because they can see it with eyes that I do not have.
So the collection really ends with a response to death. And now that we just have time for one final question, I'm going to pick one that is more open-ended. So yes, the collection ends on a more somber note, but what poetically are you most excited about? Is it books, poets, or possibilities?
Oh, wow, that's very, very open-ended. Oh, by the way, I just want to say very, very quickly that Manesh Malwani is also here at this Zoom launch. And of course, the poem that I wrote for him, the speculative fiction writer, is in Inspector. So thanks, Manesh, for actually coming to this launch. So the question is, what do I prefer more? Books?
Which of these three things are you most excited about? Books, poets, or possibilities?
Oh, it's a possibility. Oh gosh. How do you choose between them? I love the question.
Oh.
I mean, I don't love poets. I don't. I mean, I do not feel I need to go to Keats' house or Shelley's grave or even to meet with a writer in person who's still alive, because I always am afraid I'll be disappointed, right?
Is that why you've been rejecting coffee dates with me, Jee?
Right. Well, yeah, but Nietzsche is gonna be like, probably gonna be really ordinary and mundane and silly when I meet him in person, isn't it? Because writers put the best of themselves in their books, so I would want to meet the leftover of them in that sense, right? And then possibilities are great. My work is all about being open-ended and being looking at the possibilities, of continuing in some form or another. But then there's no sense of closure. There's no sense of accomplishment, right? Which, as you can sense too, is also very important to me, I think. Call it my Singaporean trait, right? You can take a boy out of Singapore, but you cannot take Singapore out of the boy. So for me, if I have to choose between these three, I would have to choose books. Because, as I said, books is where the poets have really put, the best of themselves in the books. And it's also a sign of, not just process, but also of accomplishment. Right? Because when it comes in a book form, I mean, it's not like publishing poems online, right? Somehow that seems very, very tentative, but a book, with its covers, suggesting beginning and ending, right, seems something self-contained, whole, and perhaps healing.
So your choice would be books, and that also brings us to the end of this chapter, which is our discussion over Zoom. Again, apologies to the people whose questions we didn't have time for. But I think right now, I'll probably give the time back to Jasmine to round us off. But thanks, Jee, for all the insight and the readings.
Thank you, Jerrold.
Thank you both so much. It's been a real pleasure to sit here tonight and listen to you converse about the book, and to hear you read the poems was just so wonderful. So I can't thank you both enough, and congratulations, Jee, on publication of the new book. And thank you guys for being here and like for your amazing involvement in the chat and your excellent questions. Again, I'm really sorry we didn't have time to get through them all. It's been an absolute pleasure to share this with you. Please now, immediately, go and buy yourself a copy of the book. I'm putting the link in the chat for you. Obviously, there's a discount code there. And like I said earlier, please just check your emails tomorrow and that will come for you there as well. And there's all the details there. Get in touch with us if you have any problems with that. So the next thing that I want to tell you is that he is coming to the UK very soon. For those of you who are here already, his reading tour is up online on our website, so you can catch him in person in a few cities. So check that out and sign up for the events. And finally, please join us again next time. Our next launch on Zoom is in 2 weeks' time. We're launching Dagow's new collection, and he will be talking to poet Will Harris. So I'm putting that in the chat for you as well. And that's everything from us. So thanks again so much, and another congratulations. I'll leave the chat open for you guys just for a couple of minutes to get your last questions and comments in there, but it's everything from us. So thank you very much and good night.